"Get out of here. This bank doesn't serve people like you." The shout ricocheted across the marble floor, sharp and jagged, tearing through the air like a gavel slamming in a courtroom. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. A hush fell, but it wasn't silence. It was tension, gathering fast, pressing against the glass walls of the branch like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Behind the counter, the banker's finger shot out, trembling with fury, inches from the face of a man who hadn't raised his voice once. His tie dangled forward, his jaw tight with something uglier than procedure. Every syllable carried not policy but contempt. The man being shouted at stood steady. Dark skin, plain gray t-shirt, no briefcase, no polished armor of wealth. To the room, he looked ordinary. Too ordinary for a request like his. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. One hand rested against the cool glass of the counter. The other held a phone pressed to his ear, voice low, measured, as if none of this fury could touch him. Behind the banker, a woman in a blazer leaned back, arms folded, lips curled into a smile that wasn't amusement, it was approval. Around her, other employees shifted, some uneasy, some entertained, like spectators at a fight they'd seen before. And from the line forming near the entrance, phones began to rise. A young woman in teal, wide-eyed, already recording. A man in a dark jacket, arms crossed, watching as if weighing whether to step in or let injustice write itself onto the timeline. The banker slammed his palm against the counter. "Security's on the way. People like you don't walk in and ask for millions. You're wasting our time." The man in gray exhaled, slow, steady. His eyes didn't rise, his voice didn't crack. Into the phone, he murmured 4 words only one person could hear. The syllables slipped like steel into the moment. Calm, deliberate, final. But the room didn't hear those words. The room only saw what it thought it saw. A man out of place. Too simple, too quiet, too black for the power he carried. And that assumption so loud, so public, was about to collapse in front of every lens, every witness, every whisper in this bank. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to the man in gray, because the next few minutes inside this branch will turn humiliation into reckoning. 10 minutes earlier, nothing about him suggested power. No entourage, no tailored suit, no polished shoes clicking against the marble. Just a man in a plain gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and steady eyes that had walked into more boardrooms than this branch had chairs. He carried no briefcase, no designer watch to announce his worth. Instead, a simple phone, a slim wallet, and the kind of posture that made people underestimate him. He wanted it that way. Today wasn't an accident. Today was a test. The branch itself gleamed. White tiles stretched beneath soft overhead lights. Spotless glass walls cut the morning sun into neat rectangles across the floor. The logo behind the counter shone in silver letters that claimed trust and wealth, but the energy in the room had already betrayed them. He had walked to the desk with a request most clients would whisper. A withdrawal big enough to shift numbers on a quarterly report. He gave his name, his ID, his account details calm, precise. The teller froze, stammered, then disappeared into the back office. That's when the storm began to form. From the corner, a manager in a blazer spotted him and whispered to the man now shouting. Whispers turned into sneers. By the time he was invited to step aside, the air had changed. Conversations at nearby desks slowed. A woman tapping on her phone glanced up, frowning. A young man waiting in line smirked as if he already knew how this story would go. But the man in gray had seen this look before. At 22, trying to deposit his first commission check, he was told, "Clients like you need additional verification." At 29, after years of disciplined saving, a loan officer called him high risk, even while holding collateral that outweighed the loan itself. Now, decades later, the same tone echoed, the same judgment sharpened into the same single assumption: you don't belong here. He didn't argue then, and he wouldn't argue now. That wasn't his way. He let them build their own case, brick by brick, word by word, until the wall of bias stood tall enough for everyone to see it. Then, and only then, would he take it down. Behind him, footsteps shuffled. Someone cleared their throat. The crowd was forming without permission. Phones were out. Some faces curious, some disgusted, some eager to catch drama on camera. To them, it was a scene. To him, it was history repeating. He pressed the phone closer to his ear. The voice on the other end measured, efficient, waited for his signal. He hadn't given it yet. Not yet. Timing was everything, because the real story here wasn't about the bank's marble floors, or the silver logo, or even the withdrawal itself. It was about the gap between perception and truth. A man dressed down, spoken down to, pushed toward the exit. A man no one here realized was their ultimate employer. And he was about to let them write their own ending before he turned the page for good. "Step away from the counter," the banker barked, his hand slicing through the air like a stop sign. His voice carried, sharp enough to make two people in the line behind flinch. "This area is for verified clients, not walk-ins with wild stories." The manager, the woman in the blazer, moved closer now. She didn't lower her voice, didn't even try. "Sir, if you insist on wasting our time, we'll have to escalate. Security will be here in minutes." Her smile was thin, almost rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this exact line before. A ripple moved through the lobby. Heads turned, phones lifted higher. One customer, a middle-aged man in a charcoal jacket, muttered under his breath, "This is going to get ugly." The man in gray didn't shift. His phone was still at his ear, his gaze steady, his breathing even. But the tension around him multiplied. The teller who had first greeted him peeked nervously from the back office, whispering to a colleague who quickly shook her head, as if warning him not to get involved. The banker slammed a folder onto the counter with theatrical force. "Documents don't match. Funds this large don't just appear. You think you can walk in dressed like that and request millions? Be serious." His words cut louder than the slam itself. A chuckle slipped from another employee near the printer. "Probably a scam. Happens all the time." She didn't bother to whisper. The manager folded her arms tighter. "We're not here to debate. We're here to protect our institution. If you don't leave voluntarily, we will remove you." The man in gray blinked slowly, as if measuring every word that had just been thrown at him. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He let silence do the work, silence that wrapped around the accusations and turned them into echoes. Behind him, the young woman recording whispered to the man beside her, "He gave them his ID. Why are they still acting like this?" Her phone tilted slightly higher, the red recording dot catching reflections from the polished floor. The banker noticed. His face twisted. "Turn that off, now. No videos allowed in here." But the camera didn't lower. Another client near the door pulled his own phone out, quiet but deliberate. The atmosphere shifted again, thicker now, fueled by witness and evidence. And still, the man in gray stood calm, one hand in his pocket, the other steady on his phone. He said nothing. Not yet. The banker leaned closer, voice dropping to a hiss meant for him alone but loud enough for the crowd to sense. "We know your type. You come in with fake names, fake cards, trying to steal what doesn't belong to you. Not today." The words landed like poison, spreading fast. The air, once neutral, now charged with something sharper than bureaucracy. Prejudice wasn't hiding anymore, it was center stage. And all around them, the room was no longer a bank. It was an arena, each witness waiting to see how the man in gray would respond. The room bristled with accusation, yet he didn't bite. Not once. The banker's face flushed crimson, his words tumbling over themselves louder, sharper. "Answer me. Where did the money come from? Speak up!" Each syllable demanded a defense, a crack, a surrender. But the man in gray gave none. He stood anchored, feet planted on polished tile, his phone still resting against his ear. His eyes didn't dart. His hands didn't tremble. He simply breathed slow, controlled, deliberate, like a man who had weathered storms far greater than this one. The silence unsettled them more than any protest could. The manager leaned in, her perfume mixing with the sterile scent of paper and ink. "Ignoring us won't help you. If you were legitimate, you'd explain yourself. Instead, you stand there, blank." Her voice carried, meant for the audience gathering behind him. He finally spoke, but not to her. His voice was low, into the phone, almost a whisper. "Stand by." 2 words only the person on the other end would hear. 2 words that held more weight than any argument here. The banker slammed the counter again. "That's it. He's stalling. He knows he's caught." Still no reply. The calm on his face wasn't indifference. It was memory. He remembered being 24, walking into a bank smaller than this one with a check from his very first property sale. The teller had looked him up and down and said, Funds this size don't belong to people like you. That sentence had lived in his bones for decades, fueling each late night, every acquisition, every win. Now the same words had returned, dressed in new voices, but carrying the same old venom. And yet he didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He didn't justify. Because silence here wasn't weakness. Silence was power, stretched tight, ready to snap at the right moment. A chair scraped. The young woman filming muttered, "Why isn't he saying anything?" Her companion shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the man in gray. "Because he doesn't have to." The banker tried again, his voice cracking. "Show us proof now or get out." But every word only built the stage higher, the tension sharper. The man in gray simply lowered his phone for a heartbeat, placed it gently on the counter, and looked at the banker steady, unblinking. That stare carried a message unspoken but undeniable. "You're writing your own downfall, and I won't interrupt." The silence wasn't empty, it was strategy, and everyone in the room could feel it. The room bristled with accusation, yet he didn't bite. Not once. The banker's face flushed crimson, his words tumbling over themselves louder, sharper. "Answer me! Where did the money come from? Speak up!" Each syllable demanded a defense, a crack, a surrender, but the man in gray gave none. He stood anchored, feet planted on polished tile, his phone still resting against his ear. His eyes didn't dart, his hands didn't tremble. He simply breathed slow, controlled, deliberate, like a man who had weathered storms far greater than this one. The silence unsettled them more than any protest could. The manager leaned in, her perfume mixing with the sterile scent of paper and ink. "Ignoring us won't help you. If you were legitimate, you'd explain yourself. Instead, you stand there, blank." Her voice carried, meant for the audience gathering behind him. He finally spoke, but not to her. His voice was low, into the phone, almost a whisper. "Stand by." 2 words only the person on the other end would hear. 2 words that held more weight than any argument here. The banker slammed the counter again. "That's it. He's stalling. He knows he's caught." Still no reply. The calm on his face wasn't indifference. It was memory. He remembered being 24, walking into a bank smaller than this one, with a check from his very first property sale. The teller had looked him up and down and said, "Funds this size don't belong to people like you." That sentence had lived in his bones for decades, fueling each late night, every acquisition, every win. Now the same words had returned, dressed in new voices, but carrying the same old venom. And yet he didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He didn't justify. Because silence here wasn't weakness. Silence was power, stretched tight, ready to snap at the right moment. A chair scraped. The young woman filming muttered, "Why isn't he saying anything?" Her companion shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the man in gray. "Because he doesn't have to." The banker tried again, his voice cracking. "Show us proof now or get out." But every word only built the stage higher, the tension sharper. The man in gray simply lowered his phone for a heartbeat, placed it gently on the counter, and looked at the banker steady, unblinking. That stare carried a message unspoken but undeniable. "You're writing your own downfall, and I won't interrupt." The silence wasn't empty. It was strategy, and everyone in the room could feel it. The manager finally stepped forward, heels striking the tile with sharp authority. Her arms were still crossed, chin tilted, a posture meant to project control. "Enough of this," she snapped. "You are not verified, and this branch does not tolerate imposters. Leave now, or we'll escalate further." Her words carried not caution but triumph, like a judge delivering a sentence she'd already decided. The banker grinned beside her, emboldened. "Security's already on their way. Might as well make this easy and walk out on your own." He leaned closer across the counter. "Because if they put hands on you, you won't be walking anywhere." Gasps flickered from the crowd. A woman recording whispered to her friend, "He just threatened him." The friend's reply was sharper. "And in front of all these cameras." The man in gray didn't move. Not a twitch, not a flinch. His phone sat quietly on the counter now, screen black, but anyone looking closely would notice the faint green glow at the edge still connected, still live. The junior teller in the back swallowed hard. He'd seen bad service before, dismissive tones, careless shrugs. But this was different. This was venom wearing a name tag. He shifted his weight, one foot stepping forward as if he might intervene, but the manager's glare froze him in place. Then the banker's voice cut sharp again. "This is a fraud case. He doesn't belong here." He turned deliberately, louder now, so the audience could hear. "People like him never do." The words hung heavy, toxic. A man near the entrance muttered, "That's not banking. That's bias." He didn't whisper. The room heard him. Phones swung in his direction, catching his face, catching his truth. The manager slammed a file folder onto the counter, papers scattering like broken promises. "I said leave. This is the last warning." But the threat rang hollow. Every witness knew it. The louder she grew, the smaller her authority seemed. The power in the room was shifting, subtle but unstoppable, drawn not to her raised voice but to the calm figure who hadn't raised his at all. The banker jabbed his finger one last time. "When security arrives, you'll be escorted out like the criminal you are." The crowd stirred, restless. A young woman with a phone muttered, "He hasn't broken a law. Why are they talking like he has?" Another voice added, "Because they don't see him. They only see what they want to." The room, once a bank, now felt like a trial. Only the verdict hadn't landed yet, and the man in gray, still silent, stood ready to let them finish building their own case. The door to the side office swung open with a thud. Two security guards stepped halfway into the lobby, radios clipped to their belts, scanning the scene like they were already convinced of the story told to them. The banker waved them closer, smugness tightening his jaw. "Right here," he said, pointing toward the man in gray. "This one's a fraud. We need him out now." The crowd stirred. Phones rose higher. Someone whispered, "They're really doing this." The manager leaned forward, seizing the moment. "You've wasted enough of our time. Hand over your documents," she demanded, her voice loud enough to carry across the lobby. She didn't ask. She ordered. The man in gray didn't move. His calm only seemed to irritate her more. So the banker acted. He lunged across the counter, snatching at the papers the man had laid down earlier. The slap of his hand against the counter cracked like a gunshot in the room. He yanked the ID half free before the man's quiet hand pressed down on it, anchoring it in place without effort, without aggression. The crowd gasped. A woman's voice rang out, "That's illegal. You can't just take his ID." But the banker didn't stop. "We'll let the police decide," he snarled, tugging again. "Thieves don't get courtesy here." The security guards closed in. One reached for the man's arm, hand hovering inches away. "Sir, step back, or we'll have to detain you." The manager added fuel, her tone dripping with contempt. "Dress like that, demand millions, refuse to comply, it's textbook fraud." The man in gray finally lifted his gaze, steady, unblinking. For the first time, his voice rose not loud, but firm enough to still the air. "Touch me again, and you'll answer for it." The words weren't a threat. They were a verdict, delivered in a voice too calm to be dismissed. The banker scoffed, tugging harder at the ID. "You hear that? He's resisting. Call the cops. Get him cuffed." The words "get him cuffed" landed heavy, like iron against bone. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A mother clutched her son closer. The young woman recording whispered, "This is out of control." The junior teller, frozen for so long, finally spoke, his voice shaky but clear. He gave his name. He gave ID. "You never even ran it through the system." His words cracked the silence wider than any shout. The manager snapped her head toward him, venom sharp. "Not another word, or you'll regret it." But it was too late. The room had heard, the witnesses had heard, and the cameras had captured every second. Still, the banker clung to his performance, fingers locked tight around papers he had no right to hold. Fraud, liar, criminal. Each word louder, each word thinner, until even his voice sounded desperate. The man in gray didn't wrestle. He didn't plead. He simply let the accusations pile, higher and higher, until they stood taller than the counter itself. Because the higher the pile, the harder the fall. And the fall was coming. The ID was still pinned beneath his hand, the banker's fingers twitching with frustration, when the man in gray finally shifted. Not much, just a slow, deliberate movement as he lifted his phone from the counter and pressed it back to his ear. His voice was calm, unhurried. "Activate protocol," he said. 2 words, clipped and certain, spoken like a man confirming sunrise. On the other end, a voice answered instantly, smooth and precise. "Understood, sir. Which level?" "Full," he replied. The banker's smirk faltered, though he didn't understand why. The security guards exchanged a glance, uneasy. The crowd leaned in, phones raised higher, sensing the ground tilt beneath their feet. The manager scoffed, trying to seize back control. "What is this? Calling your friend to pretend? This isn't a game. Security, escort him out." But the phone stayed pressed to his ear, his words carrying enough weight to cut through her noise. "Log the incident. Record the language. Prepare compliance review." "Yes, sir," came the voice on the line. "Timestamps noted. Video feed syncing." The banker blinked, confused. What feeds?" The man in gray didn't answer him. Instead, he lifted his eyes slowly, letting them sweep the lobby, letting every witness feel the gravity he carried without raising his tone. His silence now wasn't defense. It was command. The junior teller from earlier whispered to the colleague beside him, "Did you hear that? Compliance review? That's corporate." His colleague's eyes widened. Still, the manager pushed forward, though her voice now carried a tremor. "This doesn't scare us. Fraudsters bluff all the time." "Ugh." The man in gray spoke again, still into the phone, still steady. "Lock this branch's system for audit, effective immediately." "Yes, sir, executing." A soft chime echoed from the teller's monitor, then another, then a third. One by one, screens around the lobby flickered and froze, login windows replaced with a corporate seal and a red banner. "System locked. Audit in progress." Gasps spread like sparks. "What's happening?" one client whispered. "They're losing access," another answered. "This isn't a bluff," the young woman filming muttered, her voice trembling now, not with disbelief but awe. The banker stumbled back a step, his grip on the ID loosening. "What the hell is this?" he barked. "You can't—" But the evidence was already glowing across every frozen screen, and for the first time, the man in gray allowed the smallest curve of a smile to touch his lips. Not triumph, not gloating, just inevitability. The storm he had let them summon was finally turning. The banker's knuckles whitened as he gripped the counter, staring at the frozen monitors like they'd betrayed him. This is some kind of hack," he stammered, but the words had no anchor. His certainty, once so loud, was unraveling fast. The manager tried to rally. "Everyone stay calm, it's a system glitch, nothing more." Her smile wavered, but her voice reached for control she no longer owned. The man in gray lifted his phone from his ear, not to end the call but to let the room hear the voice on the other side. Crisp, professional, undeniable. "Audit sequence confirmed. Branch 14 amperes. Systems locked. Compliance team notified. All staff actions under live review." The words dropped like stone into water, rippling through every corner of the lobby. Gasps, whispers. Phone zoomed closer. The man in gray finally placed his phone down again, flat on the counter. His gaze swept the crowd, steady, deliberate. Then, for the first time since he'd walked into this storm, he spoke directly to the room. "You asked for my name. You demanded proof. You called me a thief in front of witnesses." He let the silence stretch, each phrase heavier than the last. "So let me give you the truth you've been too blind to see." The banker froze, his mouth half open. The manager's arms loosened at her chest. "My name," he continued, voice sharp now, rising like steel, "is David Ellis. I am the CEO of Ellis Global Holdings, the same company that acquired this bank last year." The lobby broke into gasps, a low roar of disbelief rolling through the gathered crowd. Someone dropped their phone. Another whispered, "Wait, Ellis, the owner?" He didn't pause. "I own this institution. Every desk, every dollar, every system. You just lost access to mine." His words weren't boastful. They were factual, delivered like a closing argument no jury could ignore. The banker's face drained of color. His lips moved, but nothing came out. The manager shook her head slightly, as if denial alone could turn back the clock. From the crowd, the young man in the hoodie muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Told you this was wrong." The young woman recording whispered into her phone, "He's the CEO, the owner. They tried to throw out their own boss." "Oh." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crushing. David Ellis stood calm, his presence now undeniable. The man they had dismissed as ordinary, as fraudulent, as disposable, had just revealed himself as the very foundation beneath their feet. And in that moment, every insult hurled, every accusation spat, every threat of police became not just offensive, but catastrophic. The storm had shifted, and the eye of it now belonged to him. The manager's blazer suddenly looked too heavy on her shoulders. Her arms, once folded in smug defiance, dropped to her sides. "No, this isn't possible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. The banker stumbled back from the counter, his earlier fire smothered into ash. He glanced at the frozen monitors, then at the crowd, then back at David Ellis, as if searching for some loophole in reality. But there wasn't one. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. If you're really who you say you are." He stopped, choking on the words. He already knew. The security guards, moments ago ready to lay hands on him, now shifted uneasily, hands retreating from their radios. One cleared his throat and muttered, "Sir, we weren't informed." His voice trailed off into nothing. Behind the counter, the junior teller who had dared to speak earlier leaned forward, eyes wide, vindication warming his tone. "I knew it," he said quietly, but the words were caught by the microphones of half a dozen phones recording. And the crowd was alive with energy. Whispers surged into open voices. "Did you hear that? He owns the place. They tried to call him a fraud in his own bank. This is history. I'm filming all of it." A woman near the entrance began to clap, tentative at first, then firmer. Another joined, then a third. Within seconds, the lobby pulsed with applause, a rhythm that drowned out the shallow breaths of the staff who had stood so high only minutes before. The banker shook his head violently. "You tricked us. You staged this." His voice pitched higher, desperation leaking through. "This is entrapment." But the words didn't land. Not anymore. Not with every monitor locked in audit, not with every phone raised, not with David Ellis standing calm while the branch around him fell apart. The manager turned on the banker, voice low but sharp. "You said he was bluffing. You said—" Her words broke off when David lifted his hand, not to silence her, but simply to rest it on the counter again. The gesture was small, but it commanded the room more than her shrill panic ever could. The junior teller stepped out from behind the desk now, shoulders squared. "I saw his name in the system. You told me to ignore it." His eyes locked on the manager. "You told me to treat him like a fake." "Oh." Gasps rippled again. The cameras swung to capture her face, pale now, jaw clenched against the truth. David's voice filled the silence, even though it stayed measured. "Every witness here heard your words. Every insult, every accusation. They weren't mistakes. They were choices." And as the staff withered under the weight of those choices, the clients in the lobby leaned in, phones steady, eyes blazing with the realization that they weren't just watching a confrontation, they were watching a reckoning. The banker covered his face with his hand. The manager stared at the floor. The guards stepped back entirely, and in that collapse, the balance of power shifted completely. David Ellis didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room already belonged to him. David Ellis let the silence stretch, long enough for the weight of it to press against every wall. Then he reached for his phone once more, tapped the screen, and spoke in a tone so even it cut sharper than any shout. "Compliance," he said. "Suspend branch 14 amperes staff access. Effective immediately." The voice on the other end responded without hesitation. "Confirmed. Executing now." Almost instantly, the bank's systems obeyed. Screens flickered again, this time not just locked but blanked out entirely. Error codes spilled across monitors. A chorus of electronic beeps echoed as keycards lost power, turning from green to angry red. The banker fumbled with his ID badge, swiping it desperately against the reader by the side door. Red. Again. Red. His face drained, panic bubbling in his throat. No, this can't." The manager tried hers next, slamming it against the reader as if force could override authority. Red. Again and again. The sound was final, merciless. Gasps filled the lobby, followed by a murmur that swelled into words. "They're locked out." He shut them down. Right here, in front of everyone. David didn't move from his place at the counter. His posture remained calm, controlled, but every syllable carried a blade. "This branch has embarrassed itself, its clients, and the institution it represents. Effective this moment, you are no longer authorized to operate under its name." The banker staggered back, his voice breaking. "You can't do this. I've been here 15 years. David's gaze didn't waver. 15 years of service doesn't excuse 15 minutes of prejudice. The manager reached for words, but none came. Her hands trembled at her sides. The swagger drained from her shoulders. The security guards stepped fully back now, arms raised slightly, as if surrendering to a truth they couldn't refute. One muttered quietly, "We're done here," and turned toward the door. The crowd buzzed louder, phones catching every second. The young woman who had filmed from the beginning whispered into her mic, "He just shut the whole branch down. Right here. Right now." David's voice carried once more, low but absolute. "Your access is revoked. Your titles are revoked. And every word you spoke today is already logged for review. The system doesn't forget." The room fell into stunned silence again, but this time, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was cleansing, like air after a storm. The banker sank into a chair, hands buried in his face. The manager simply stared at the floor, as if the marble beneath her feet had become quicksand. And around them the witnesses knew this wasn't just punishment. This was justice delivered in real time. David Ellis didn't need theatrics. He only needed truth. And now, truth had stripped the branch bare. The lobby was silent now, the kind of silence that follows a storm when the air is heavy but clean. The banker slumped in his chair, eyes hidden behind his hand. The manager stood stiff, staring at nothing, her power dissolved into the marble beneath her shoes. Around them, the crowd remained, phones still raised, witnesses still alert, every angle captured for the world beyond these walls. David Ellis straightened, not dramatically, not to gloat, simply to stand in the dignity they had tried to strip from him. His voice, calm and measured, filled the space once more. "You tried to call me a fraud," he said, gaze locked on the banker, then shifting to the manager. "You shouted at me in a bank I own. You tore at my ID. You threatened my freedom. You mocked my place here." He paused, letting the words weigh themselves. "And all of it happened because you decided to mistake appearance for truth." "Yeah." The crowd murmured, a low current of agreement flowing through the room. Someone whispered, "Say it again," as if the statement itself was medicine. David continued, his tone sharpened not with anger, but with certainty. "What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice rooted in bias, in arrogance, in the comfort of thinking no one would ever hold you accountable." His eyes swept the staff. "But accountability isn't optional. Not anymore." Ugh. A woman near the entrance lowered her phone slightly, her voice soft but audible. "Finally." David turned slightly toward the witnesses, acknowledging them without theatrics. "You didn't need to film this for me. I didn't need an audience to prove who I am, but your presence matters because you saw it. You saw how quickly dignity can be denied and how necessary it is to defend it." The room seemed to lean closer. He rested a hand lightly on the counter, the same counter where accusations had tried to bury him minutes ago. "I don't need to record injustice. I don't need to shout to prove my worth. I am the result of every insult, every rejection, every door slammed in my face. That is the record. That is the evidence. And today, you've written another chapter in it." His words cut deeper than the locks on the staff's badges. They weren't just directed at the bankers, they were aimed at every bias hiding behind policy, every prejudice dressed up as procedure. David Ellis lifted his phone once more, not for a call, but for a closing act. "Compliance. Note the time. Branch 14 Amperes is under direct CEO oversight until further notice." "Logged," the voice replied. Then he placed the phone down, his final gesture deliberate. He looked at the stunned employees one last time, then back at the witnesses. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands still and waits for the truth to catch up. With that, he stepped away from the counter, shoulders steady, presence unshaken. The applause rose again, not raucous, not forced, but steady and certain. And as the cameras followed him out, one truth was undeniable. Silence hadn't been his weakness. Silence had been his weapon.